Okay, so this is going to be a chat between two engineers. We have myself, Duncan Coutts, and Neil Davies here. We'll just briefly introduce ourselves, and then we'll talk about what we're going to be talking about this session. So yeah, my name's Duncan Coutts. I'm the Cardano technical architect for my sins. So I've been working on the new Cardano implementation for quite some time, overseeing the technical details of it, and we've been working with Neil on that project on the redesign of the new Cardano since the beginning of that project too. Neil, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yep, I'm Neil Davies, and my long-term background is actually in how large-scale distributed systems perform. And Duncan sort of recruited us to help with the issues of how to design systems so that you can manage their performance and assess their performance, and also to make sure that we can make the right architectural and protocol interaction decisions to give us the best possible starting point to maximize the performance, remembering that this is a world scale object.
Yeah, so people sometimes describe what we're doing as just networking, but it's really a lot more than that. It's there's definitely networking in it, but it's about performance of really the performance of the whole system.
Well, it's really a sort of a distributed one machine doing one purpose, running on tens of thousands of nodes distributed across the globe, basically.
That doesn't trust itself. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't trust anybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't even trust its near neighbors. So it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. So let's see. So there's going to be no video of me because that's the way I roll. Neil, you're perfectly welcome to.
I think I'm going to turn my
video
off.
Or you can keep turning off.
No, I can make. If I turn my video off, at least I can make faces and not get seen caught on camera.
Right.
So I'll do that now.
So let's just summarize. What are we going to be talking about? So we don't have fancy slides for everything. We're mostly just going to be the format is going to be a chat between engineers. But here's what we're going to aim to cover. So we can talk about measurements, measurements of blockchain system performance, TPS, and well, why we think TPS is actually not so great, and we're going to propose a few other measurements that we think are useful. We're going to talk about how fast is the real internet, because that turns out to be really important for the design constraints and the performance of these kinds of systems. We're going to look at how fast is Cardano. We're going to look at we're going to share some of our benchmarking results that we have for the current Byron BFT code, and then we're also going to talk about some fairly new stuff, which is about how we calibrate Ouroboros Preos, which of course is also based a lot on it's a timing and performance and security they're all interconnected with Preos. So that's actually a rather interesting one. But yeah, let's kick off with TPS.
So let's start with that point. So what does it mean? I mean, the key thing. Yeah, right. So let's start off with what is TPS. So TPS stands for transactions per second. Well, I'm going to ask myself the first question: is that what you're really interested in? In general, an end user of this system is interested in how long it takes their transaction to settle on the chain, because they want to base a real world action on it. So, instantaneously, the TPS is a sort of system-centric metric for bragging about how fast your system runs, and you've already divorced it from what the end user is really interested in, right?
So it's not an end user measure at all, is it?
It is basically, mine's bigger than yours, okay?
Right, and then comparing between different systems, right? So my blockchain system is bigger and better and faster than yours.
Yeah. But then, even at that point, what does a transaction do? And it's reasonably clear that moving a piece of money, i.e. moving from one UTXO to another UTXO, which is the minimal sort of transaction that you can perform, is of far less utility than, shall we say, a transaction that has 10, 20, 50, 100 UTXOs in it, because that could be
transaction UTXO outputs, you mean?
UTX outputs, yeah, and that gets you to transfer that. You're paying 100 bills that way. So you could look at, if when I come to pay my monthly bills or whatever, do I have 15 transactions or do I have one? Okay.
And indeed, exchanges really do this. They have, when they're paying out lots and lots of people, they do it in batches, and they do it with one transaction that might pay out to 10 withdrawals from an exchange. So absolutely.
So basically, and to say that that is equivalent to the first the other type of transaction is a bit it's a bit disingenuous. Okay.
So one of the points there is that TPS is an easy measure to game, because you can pick ridiculously small and useless transactions, or you can, and it doesn't fairly compare between the sort of size of the transaction. You just to maximize your TPS, you would just make all the transactions small.
Yeah. And then there are things that just aren't simple transactions. As soon as you start thinking smart contracts or things like that, then the amount of data
then transactions are just not comparable to each other. It's not, you can't have a single unit, a single transaction being your unit, because a big Plutus script is not the same as a small Plutus script. It runs, the running times are totally different.
Yeah. So you then end up with this. So it's horses. There's a horses for courses argument here, but also there is also another way of if you want to get my mine's faster than yours game, then basically I think there are ways in which you can do that. Okay. And actually, we're going to show you in a minute a few numbers, but I think we've come up with the sort of measure of an Ethereum. I thought was a rather nice measure, wasn't it? This.
So we've got some precise measures, and then we've got some sort of casual measures. Do you want to pull up your slide about the?
Yeah, I was going to pull up my slide about the Ethereum one here. Right, so I'm going to take over, and I am going to show this. So this is a slide from an internal presentation we gave at the tail end of last year, and actually, pick your bragging rights. It was what we just said. How do you want to do your bragging? And we're using this as a sort of relative measure. And for those of you who maybe follow the IT press, there's something called the register. What is the hand that bites IT that feeds it?
The bites IT, yes.
Yes, that feeds it or something. It's called. And they have a nice set of ad hoc, colloquial measures like micro whaleses and Olympic-sized swimming pools and things like this.
How many London double-decker buses? Sort of like all these different units, like a length or a volume or a size or whatever.
So we thought, well, just choose an Ethereum, right? And what is an Ethereum?
So one Ethereum then becomes a unit of blockchain performance. Yeah. So what is one Ethereum? So basically, if you look back through etherscan.io, there was a day, 4th of January 2018, in which the height of something going on, because it's a pretty big peak, in which those 1.1 million transactions were shipped in 5,750 blocks. And that sort of leads to the fact that, that what Ethereum did over that day was to effectively move 2 kilobytes of transaction bytes per second. So that's transaction data. That's thinking about transactions not as a single transaction as a unit, but thinking of how big are those transactions measured in bytes.
Yeah, and so
that's a data rate.
That's a data rate. So 14 TPS and or 2 kilobytes of transactions.
2 kilobytes a second
is basically an Ethereum as a relative measure. And the other thing is, if you're going to use this for money, there's another sort of way in which you can think about this. Is instead of looking at how many Cardano or how many blockchain transactions, how many people could you pay, right? And what we're basically saying here is you could say, hey, one output, one UTXO output is equivalent to paying a person, something, a fiscal payment. Now, you need a measure there to give you some feel, right? So the UK faster payments, which is not actually truly interbank, and it's sort of the scheme by which your banks send money to send money on your behalf to either other individuals or other businesses. But it is the real bulk transfer mechanism for moving money in the United Kingdom now. And that's running at around about 200 million payments a month, right? So if you can do 75 fiscal transactions a second on average, you can on average replace the UK faster payment system. And I say that with my tongue firmly in my cheek. Okay, for that sort of stuff.
So we've actually got three measurements here, right? So we've got so one measurement is to say, don't look at TPS, look at financial transactions, and then that counts for when you've got when a single blockchain transaction could account for many useful economic transactions. Then we've got the Ethereum measure, which is, but then we didn't talk exactly about the bytes per second one. Why bytes per second?
Well, because it turns out when you look at what the absolute constraints are that you can't get away from in building a global blockchain system, it turns out the universe gets in the way in terms of speed of light, issues of round trip times, and all of those limit effectively the amount of data per second you can ship. So it comes down to your real constraint is how many bytes per second can I ship across the network in these transactions and get them into the chain, right. Is my limiting factor. How you carve up those bytes per second into transactions or fiscal or smart contracts is a different problem, but that's the constraint.
So yeah, right. So the point is that the primary constraint. I mean, if you're not dealing with very expensive long running contracts, then your primary constraint is going to be actually the network and how much data you can move, and therefore bytes per second gives you a comparable measure across different systems. All those systems face that same constraint. And
actually, it's not even, I mean, I think the network again is this word network means so many things.
Well,
it's really your ability to diffuse the data quickly. It's about how fast the information can be shipped. Yes, not the network.
But then the nice thing about a bytes per second measure is, as you said, it means that you can. It's comparable because you can use that data for many different things. Whereas when you're saying, one transaction, one blockchain transaction, well, what does that mean? They can be big, they can be small. Well, when you're saying bytes per second, that's much clearer. If you're moving 1 kilobyte in a second, you can use that 1 kilobyte for lots of small ones or a few big ones, and it doesn't really matter. So it gives you that sort of comparison between different systems that might, have different size transactions or be used in different ways. So it gives you a much more comparable unit.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what we've set out here is a couple of ways of measuring things. Yes, you can choose them in different ways depending on what you want to brag about. But if you're trying to assess something and to get a feel for what it's going, at least it gives you several ways of looking at how the system performs.
So I think we would summarize and say that our favorite one here is the TPS bytes per second, transaction bytes per second, and then the nice casual colloquial one to put that in context is how many Ethereums is that? Based on Ethereum does about 2 kilobytes per second, or can do at its peak performance.
Right. So I mean, that said, I think we can now think about how fast does Cardano actually perform? Yes. Right.
Yeah.
And again, these are results from the end of last year. And this particular slide deck was because we went through a validation exercise. Because remember, we had to make a whole set of decisions 2 to 3 years ago as to what we were aiming for. And having made all of those decisions, we made a whole bunch of design decisions and built things and measured things. And this was the point where we were bringing everything together, and we said, okay, we're our guesses. Can we meet our guesses? Can we do this? Right?
Yeah.
And so, let's
unfortunately, the answer was yes, and more so.
Oh yeah, yes. Well, we should say that the answer is yes. But if it was no, then we would have been more sleepless nights would have occurred. Anyway, so just to give you some idea, so what we have here, this notion of a TPS limit is actually.
We should probably say what we. I mean, what's our experimental setup here?
Okay, this is not a complex setup. The intention here was to check the time to create blocks. The signing costs of blocks and the ability to ship blocks to different places in the world just one hop. And we'll talk about, because you'll see in a minute when we start talking about how the topology of the network will work, these are the fundamental measures of which that you're going to use to build those models. Okay. So this is
this was based on a setup with a worldwide.
One was I think one was in South America and the other was in Sydney and the other was in Frankfurt or something. Okay.
Yeah. So this is fully,
as far away as we can.
Yeah.
As far away from the world, around the world as we could get. Okay.
And then we've used a transaction generator to artificially generate transactions at a certain rate, and that's what that TPS limit column there is.
That's the rate at which the limiter was set.
Yeah, that was saying how fast the transaction generator would try to generate transactions if it was able to submit them quickly enough to the network.
Yep. And there is a reason why you can't reach the limit, right? And the reason for the limit is that the system, we carefully designed this system that if you try to put in too many transactions and the mempools start to fill up, okay, there's back pressure.
Yeah.
So the sort of adage for that is we have sent tens of millions of transactions into this system in test, and not one has been lost. Okay. Now it's not to say they can't be lost, but that requires really an adverse set of circumstances, like you've just submitted it to a new node, of your first node in the chain, in your network connection to the boards of the blockchain, and it crashes before it sends it out, and the wallet will recover from that, but it's going to be a rare event. Okay.
And the basic intuition as to why we can get that kind of back pressure is because you don't push transactions into the system. You politely ask, and you say, I have this transaction that I would like to submit, and then if it's ready for you, it comes back and says, yes, okay, please give it to me. And if it's not ready for you, it just doesn't ask for it. And if you would try to push it, that would be a protocol violation, and it would disconnect you. So it's always this kind of pull-driven style, and that way it avoids being overloaded.
And that avoiding overloading is a critical part of how we manage the risk of resource consumption attacks, DOS attacks of that form. So that's part of our DOS protection mechanisms, is the way the protocols themselves are actually designed.
Okay, so let's look at this first row then. What have we got there? So that's we're saying it was a batch of 50,000 transactions. Each of them was of its normal size with an extra 100 bytes added to give a bit of payload. One input, one output, sending them at 45 transactions per second.
We achieved 36.3.
36.3. Fiscal and TPS there are the same in this case because it's one input, one output. But we'll see later lower down the column when you've got multiple outputs, then the fiscal transactions is higher than that.
And then basically this is then equivalent. Oh, this word refined, by the way, is
what's that?
It means first of all you start the system up, you set it up, you create a big enough UTXO in the mempool so that you can actually run lots of transactions. Then you stop sending transactions for a second, let it settle, and then you go for the benchmark. And this benchmark, these numbers here are for that benchmarking period, not that we're excluding the warm up and the cool down of the system. It's just running flat out. Okay,
so it's the middle bit of the benchmark when it is running.
The middle bit of the run. Yeah, and so that gets us 36.3 TPS, 9.6 kilobytes of transaction bytes per second.
Right. So that's already quite a lot, and and then there's our comparison with Ethereum. So what we said, Ethereum was just around 2,000 or 2 kilobytes per second, and here this is at just under 10. So it's nearly,
and
it's in this base setup here, it's nearly 5 Ethereums.
Yep, and that was sort of the first test. Okay, and what that's producing, in order to support that amount of data, right, then the blocks which were in this system coming every 20 seconds had to basically be 193 kilobytes.
Yeah, nearly 200k blocks.
You need 200k blocks. Okay, and then having had a bit of success there, at which point we knew those
remind me, by comparison, the Ethereum blocks when it was at peak performance there, they were every 15 seconds.
But they were about
30k, weren't they?
About 30k, right? So we were running, bigger blocks,
Yeah.
slightly less frequently.
Yeah.
Right. Then of course, you say, okay, let's run it faster. Okay, like that. And then you'd be seeing.
So that's changing the transaction generator to try and generate them more quickly.
And we got to 43.7 transactions a second, right? At this point,
which pushes you just over 5 Ethereums.
Just over 5 Ethereums, and you're getting to a quarter of a megabyte per block, and then you start playing, right?
Bigger
and
transactions.
So bigger transactions.
And it's actually worth noting that the 2-2 is 2 inputs, 2 outputs is actually the most realistic one, because that's what most UTXO transactions actually are: 2 inputs, 2 outputs, because of the way the system change addresses work.
Yeah, and the way the system, the system has slightly different performance characteristics, because actually, it's more bytes are doing slightly less computational work. So this is why the numbers don't scale linearly, because there are different effects in the different parts of the system. But hey, you've hit 7 Ethereums there, right? With blocks
in terms of data rates, yeah.
In terms of data rates, yeah. And then you go a little bit ridiculous, and don't. The other thing is that 77 fiscal transactions a second. Remember a few minutes ago, 75 TPS, to fiscal transactions a second, equivalent to the whole UK money moving in the faster payment system. So that serves a population of roughly 60 million.
Yes. Although actually in practice, you'd have to go to the next row for 4 outputs because of the way change addresses work. But still, I mean, you go to the next row and there you've got 120. So that's roughly double the 75.
Yeah. Okay, and what you've got interesting things happening down the side is these blocks are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay,
so that's 350k, 470k, 630k.
Yeah, so you're into the situation where, and bigger blocks take they take longer to move. They have more work to be done, to be forwarded, and to be validated at each of the forwarding steps. So you're doing a lot more work here, we were very impressed by the way that basically we might use 30 or 40% of the CPU for the seconds it was processing this stuff. This really wasn't. We weren't hitting the CPU limits at all in this process.
Yeah, it's all network bound.
So so that sort of gets you that there was adequate headroom, and I think this is the point to deal with the question. Actually, is it's fast. The way this system is as fast as you want it to be. Right.
Yeah. Right. So what would a system that looks like 600 kilobyte or just half a megabyte blocks every 20 seconds?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've got the equivalent of the pocket calculator there, haven't you?
Yeah. Okay.
So what's right? So 500 kilobytes times 3 to get every minute. Or divide it by 20 and then multiply it by 3 times 10 to the 7. That's how many seconds there are in a year. This shows me. We end up with. I think you can hear the cogs whirring in the background. Yeah, that's a lot of data per year.
Yes. Let's see. I'll have to think about it for a second. Do the right calculation.
So 500, 0.5 meg divided by 3 times 3 times 10 to the 7. Divided by 20 times 3 times 10 to the 7.
We want 500 times 3 to get to a minute times 60 minutes in an hour, 24, 365.
Yeah, that's another way of doing it.
Yeah. Okay, and then divide that. But let's see, and then I want that in megabytes. No, I want it in gigabytes.
Right.
So that becomes 788 gigabytes.
Okay. So okay, we're knocking on
the internet reliably informs me that the entire Bitcoin blockchain, I looked this up yesterday, I think it was 288 currently.
So that's 3 times as much as Bitcoin has ever produced per year. So basically, you run a system like this for 3 months, and you will have produced as much data.
270 gigabytes. That's how big Bitcoin is right now.
So we basically run this for 4 months, and you've basically constructed as much information as Bitcoin has done in 10 years.
Yeah, so that's nearly 3 Bitcoins
yes.
of data per year.
So people got lifetime data.
And that's and Bitcoin's been running for several years.
10 plus years. Yeah. So interestingly, you've got to store that data.
And you'd have to download it. If you were to join the network, you'd have to download it all.
Actually, as Cardano, as a public blockchain, is intended to connect the billions of people, this would be a very high cost for those people to run full nodes. Okay, so actually, you're now into the position where the system can build a system that will destroy itself under its own weight of managing it. Its economic management.
The cost as a user of the system is just too high. You need a terabyte hard drive every year.
Yeah,
and that might be cheap for some people, but that's very expensive for some other people.
Yeah,
infeasibly expensive.
Infeasibly expensive.
And that's not even counting the time it would take then to join the network and download everything and validate everything.
Yeah. It might take you 6 months to join a network because your network to join the blockchain, because your network's capacity is such that it will take you that long to download the 5-6 terabytes that you needed for the data.
And that's with half megabyte blocks, and people then go and talk about 2 megabyte blocks or whatever. And then
guess what?
That's now 4 terabyte hard drives per year that you need.
So I think the assertion we have here is that it's as fast as you want it to be.
Yeah, you would. If it were actually running this fast, there are many people who would not actually want to use that system. It would be too resource intensive. So I think that's sort of as fast as you would want it.
Yeah, as fast as you would want it.
If we can go probably faster than you would actually want to use as a public system. You could certainly configure this as a private system with a small number of users who are prepared to pay the resource costs, and they need those higher throughputs.
Yeah. So, and don't forget, the way the whole system is designed, the difference between a public and a private system is literally the configuration file. Pretty much so. Okay. Right. So I think that sort of covers off the second point we wanted to get over, wasn't it? How fast do you want?
How fast is Cardano? And the answer is it's fast enough, and it's faster than you would actually want to use, or it could scale to rates that would be faster than you would actually practically want to use on the public system.
Okay, so what are the scaling limits? But so we're not. That's not the limit. The limit's going to be an economic one for the people using it. Well, throwing economics out of the window for the moment. What speed could we really get?
How fast?
What are the fundamental? Okay, so should we look at the? There was, I think, here.
Yeah, so we keep talking about the data. The
data rates.
We're going to come on to the the data rates and how fast is the internet.
But just to give you some idea of how. First of all, I think we introduce the effect of geography.
Right. So this is the same benchmark, but we're now looking at a different measure.
Yeah, and what we're seeing here is how long this forge event is the point at which the slot leader decides it's leading, and switch to chain is the event which says I have now adopted that chain in my node. And this gives you some idea of the data rates of the times that takes. Okay.
So this is basically the diffusion time or the broadcast time from when a block is finished being created. So forge event is the end of creation through to when the other nodes, in the other data centers, other parts of the world, actually adopt that chain, switch to that chain.
And you see that there's a sort of fundamental limit about, actually the current figures are better than this, but about 1 second here, which says, hey guys, it takes me this long just to process chains of this size, right? And then there's time to ship and time to adopt. And interestingly,
so the ones that we see at the bottom, those are between nodes that are within the same region, or is that on the local machine?
That's actually on the local machine, so that's an infinitely fast network, effectively.
So that's the time. That's basically the time for validating that block locally.
Yeah.
And then the scatter at the top is the time to get it from.
Diffuse.
Yeah, like the pink one is EU to Australia. So that's it was forged on the EU node and then shipped across and then adopted and validated on the Australian node. So the scatter at the top is including the time to ship the block across the world.
And okay, so that But these weren't trivial size blocks, because this is the same data now, but by block size. Okay, so these are for blocks, all of which were bigger than
550K up to kind of over 700K.
Right. So these numbers are for things that are things we've already described as economically infeasible to run anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are, but this is giving you some idea of what the system was looking like in December, and we got no worse since then.
So it's interesting here that you see that it does clearly scale with the size of the block, but not that strongly. I mean, there's a lot of overheads here.
Well, there's a lot of fixed costs, isn't there?
Right,
in some way,
right.
yeah. There's costs that are fixed in this process, and one of the big fixed, and by the way, the cost here is actually time, right? It's not CPU seconds necessarily. It's just the passage of time as information is copied from one part of the world to another. So, and if you start looking at time as a resource, and it's a resource you just can't beat, or you can't do faster than time, then this is when you start looking at the problem in a slightly different way. Okay,
so this goes into
that was
I mean this overhead of the EU AU one, say, the pink one, compared to the local. This is all about how long does it take to get the data from here to there. And
so let's move on to keeping away of time. Let's move on to a little bit about what the world looks like in terms of speed, right? Because this is what leads on to the issue of how the Preos parameters have to be chosen. Yeah.
Right.
So some more statistics. Okay. How big is the world?
So what are we doing here? So we're looking at how fast is internet, basically, or how quickly can you ship data across the internet, or how long does it take to get information back and forth? Because as we were saying earlier, that really turns out to be the sort of fundamental limitation. I mean, given the way that blockchain algorithms work, this is the fundamental limitation on their performance.
Well, because they've all caused. I mean, the very definition of a blockchain is the subsequent chains are causally linked to the previous ones.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a causality relationship between them.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So and that's so everything that part of the process has to be done sequentially.
So you've done. So what we're looking at here is based on a load of measurements, Neil, that you and your colleagues did, looking at measurements between basically almost all the Amazon data centers in the world. So we used Amazon data centers as a proxy for fairly well connected parts of the internet, but spread out across all the regions that in the world that Amazon supports, modulo 1 or 2, and then we're looking at various things. We're looking at how long does it take basically to get a ping back and forth, a single UDP packet.
So this is a measure of the fastest way in which you can get something. Please give me this. Here it is.
Information. Yeah.
Small piece of information.
And then in second, we'll look at the measurements that you've done of sending bigger files using TCP. But so this one here is the round trip time. So this is measuring time to send one UDP packet and get a reply between all. I think you did, was it 14 Amazon data centers? And
so it's each one to each other.
Measure the times between all combinations of those 14. And
you end up with this sort of distribution. Okay, right. So it shows you that some of them are within sort of 30 milliseconds of each other, and those are typically the ones
that's time in seconds on the x-axis. So
yes,
the upper end
bad of me. I should have put that in
0.35. So that's 350 milliseconds at the high end, and like down at 30 milliseconds at the bottom.
Yep. And what we're saying here is 30 milliseconds. That's typically inside Europe. When you get to other continents, even inside the continent, the distances are 100 milliseconds. I think with Tokyo to Singapore or something like that, or down the spine of East Asia, is those sorts of times. Partially because the distances are larger, and partially because actually the cables go out to sea and then go around the edge of the landscape because of the nature of the development within that part of the world at this time. And then you end up with some of the bigger outliers, and those are things like Singapore to Sao Paulo, okay, which are, and Sydney to Sao Paulo, which go different ways around the world, interestingly. But they are what happens. Okay, they exactly.
So these are kind of the best case scenarios for the internet of getting, a single small piece of information without any reliability support at all.
Issues. We're assuming perfect delivery. This is effectively the cost of just going through all of those switches and along all those optical fibers.
And so in the best case, when it's nearby, it's a few tens of milliseconds, and then it gets into the hundreds and up to the 300 plus.
And which is an important part.
Some people, right? I mean, if you ping Google or whatever, you'll find that it's maybe 10, 20 milliseconds. But that's because Google have servers that are nearby to you. But if we have to get full worldwide distribution, we really do have to get data that was produced in South America and deliver it to Australia, and do that with the
timely,
and do it within the timing constraints that we have. Yeah.
Okay, so so you look at this. This is basically you're measuring the sort of width of the world in time to get the information. And there are elements in our protocol, like giving the next header or do you want a transaction, which are of this order of magnitude because they are round trips. They are basically round trips that we can't get rid of.
A single packet going back and forth. I mean, not UDP, but still a single packet.
Single packet, which is moving technically ballistically, right? I.e., there's no flow control here. It's just it just fires it, and it sort of ballistically through the network.
So let's look at moving some serious amount of data then, starting with.
Yeah, so let's start at moving it again.
The first one here is moving 100 kilobytes. So
100 kilobytes, right? But it's basically, you'll see a bit later, we're planning to do, our starting point is slightly less than this because it works perfectly well. So 100 kilobytes is a proxy for what we think we have to get, what we have to do as a starting point. Right, and we can now talk about things like, well, how long does it actually take? So if I sort of pick this and ask.
And importantly, we're using TCP here because that's
yes, we are using TCP. We're using TCP on an open TCP connection.
Right. So this is a TCP connection that's already been established. So this is not counting your SYN-ACK handshake. This is the TCP connection that was already established, but was idle. And then
and the important thing about it being
then we're starting to send 100 kilobytes. And why is that? Why is that our benchmark setup?
Well, idle is really important. This is why you've got to be careful how you do benchmarks so you don't fool yourself. Because these blocks are arriving seconds apart, even in Preos, TCP closes down its congestion window back to its minimum after about 4 or 5 round trip times. And in almost all circumstances, when we come to ship a block, we will actually be in the position where the window size is at its default minimum. Okay, about 10 packets. So every time we ship something, we have to open the congestion window. Now, I know that, the people that say, but you could change this, you could modify it, you could change the operating system, you can set flags. But part of our design brief was you didn't have to be a Unix guru in order to make this system work.
It has to run on the syscontrol kernel parameters to have this work. Yeah, we have to make this work on default configurations of systems that people can really deploy.
Obviously, there's room for optimization after that, but that's we're designing the global system, not tweaking an individual system to run it flat out in some way.
Because you've got to remember that these nodes are not being run by us, right? It's not a centralized system. It's being run by lots of people, and you have to make this thing easy enough to use. You can't just say everyone has to be running a modified kernel or modified special parameters.
Right. Okay. So that's 100 kilobytes.
Okay. So what have we got there? Data. So before with a single packet, it was down at the maximum was out at 350 milliseconds, and here it's just over a second.
Under a second. Yeah, because it turns out that the TCP protocol will send 10 packets, and then when the acknowledgement for the first packet comes back, it will then send another 2, and then when the next one comes back, it'll send another 2. So it takes a certain number of round trip times to open the window, and this is basically 100 kilobytes. You can't get that into 10 packets.
So it's doubling every time, right? So it sends 10 packets. and then when the first reply comes back, then it will double that 20 packets, and then a full round trip, then it will send 40 packets, and double and double and double.
So it's called slow start. I do like the notion that exponential growth is slow start. Always a piece of internet PR there, right? Okay, that's 100 kilobytes, and that doesn't look bad. It's okay. 1 second. That's right. What happens when I start fiddling with larger numbers?
So now we're going from 100 kilobytes to about a megabyte.
About a megabyte, remember, right? Oh, okay, it's not going too badly, but there's a nasty outlier there. Okay,
but the main body is where it used to be around 1 second the maximum. Now it's out at kind of 3 seconds as the maximum. Apart from that one outlier there.
One outlier there, and then
so that's not too bad. When you've gone up by a factor of 10 for the data you're sending, and it's increased by a factor of 3 the time it takes.
Yep, and now let's look at the next one up. 2 meg. Oh, 2 meg. We actually haven't gone up that much further
on the median times.
Except on the median times, because at this point, but the outlier goes through the roof, right? And the reason for this is at this point now you have opened up the window a lot, right? You've paid the round trip time, so you're getting, it may take just another round trip time to go from 1 meg to 2 meg, the difference, because you've now got a bigger window. It's already opened up 4 or 5 times, right? That outlier, which happened to be between Singapore and Canada, that's probably the effect of loss on the line. Okay.
So that's packet loss, and then the way that TCP then has to deal with that packet loss.
So the real, one of the real issues here is as soon as you start to get packet loss, all bets are off for keeping the data, the timeliness clumped to the left-hand side, because you're now introducing complete round trip times to resolve those problems.
And it reduces the window size again,
and there's a whole bunch of interactions at that point. So, so that says, well, how are we going to deal with this? Well, actually, it's all about how you construct the network connectivity, the network topologies, right? And
so that is
even in the
peer-to-peer graph construction in the
underlying the network layer, the bearers
between all the blockchain nodes.
And in that particular case, if you actually look at it, it was a bad day, a bad moment between Singapore and Canada directly, but you could imagine it as being forward to an intermediate node on the west coast of the United States, and then getting to Canada in much less time than this. So this wouldn't have affected even the performance of the blockchain system, because there are alternative routes for the data flowing. Right.
So we can deal with some of these outliers, provided that there are alternative routes, and the way that the block broadcast works, it will find those alternative routes.
It basically takes the fastest route it can find. And if one of the paths turns out to be particularly slow, it has a very marginal effect on the overall system performance.
Provided there's other routes.
It's provided there's other routes.
And it should be well interconnected, so it should be.
Yeah. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, right?
Okay,
let's move on. And I think
that's how fast the internet is. It takes several seconds to move realistic sized files across the internet. A single hop. Right? So now what we really have to ask is, well, how does this start to affect Preos? Because this is the key. The key question is, how will Preos work, right? Right. So now we're moving on to a slightly different topic. Now we're saying, we've made all these measurements, and now we're at the stage of, and we've got our existing system benchmarks, and we want to say, how are we going to pick all those parameters for Preos? Because Preos has a bunch of interesting parameters, and it depends crucially on how long does it take to get the data from here to there, how long does it take to shift blocks around, and that affects both the performance of Preos, but also its security is based on the based on this.
And we can't build, we cannot build a pre-existing Preos system with all these nodes and all the state distribution, test it, and then before we release it. So we really have to have good models of how it's likely to perform and have confidence in those models.
So so what we've done here is we've made simulations, and we'll explain what the simulation is in a second, and we've calibrated that simulation based on the real world data that Neil and his colleagues have measured on how long does it take to move data across the internet between all the Amazon data centers. So what's our simulation here? We're saying, so in this particular one.
Okay.
Do you want to explain the setup?
We have made the decision, right, that we are expecting people to deploy their stake pools behind relays, right? This is an important thing. No one running a security system in their right mind will actually put their system directly on the internet. And it's not because of our protocols or breaking through our systems. It's because there might be a 0-day exploit that basically permits you to get into that machine from the outside internet. And because there are copies of keys so people can masquerade as you, you're going to put it behind some sort of application level firewall, which is what we're simulating here. Okay.
And a relay is a perfect application level firewall.
Perfect application firewall. So the out degree, the valency from that node that's generating, got a stake pool holder, is 2. It connects
when we
just
say valency,
to.
we mean the number of peers that each node is connected to.
Yeah. So there's 2 at that point, and then each out degree in the graph. Yeah. Each one of those relay nodes is connected to 4 other peers.
For other relays belonging to other stake pools.
And what Lars called the lone riders, people who have decided they want to run their own stake pools and connect them directly to the network with small amounts of stake.
Right. So this is an important assumption that we've made here. So we were saying that 80% of the stake is going to be held by these large stake pools, and 20%.
1,000 of them.
1,000 of them in this case, and then 20% of the stake is going to be held by people running their own stake pool from home, basically. And so we're not assuming that they are public stake pools that you can delegate to. It's just people choosing, I want to run my own. I might make more money by delegating to a public one, but I want to run my own. And so we're making a quite conservative assumption here that 20% of the stake in the system is actually held by sort of private stake pools, which are small scale stake pools. So in this particular configuration, you can see at the top here it says pools 1,000. So that's 1,000 public stake pools. Lone riders or private stake pools, small scale stake pools 9,000, with an 80-20 split between the stake between the big public ones and the private ones. And then the valency parameters there, 2, that's for how many relays are the stake pools are running each, which is relatively small. There might be more than that in a real system. Valency of 4 between all those public relays and the between the public relays, and then the private stake pools, we're assuming they're 3, that they're connected to 3 other.
Yeah, and those 4 is they could either go to another stake pools relay, or they could be going to somebody who's one of the 9,000
small scale private stake pools. Yeah.
Yeah. So this together is so the 1,000, that's 10,000 nodes. actually it's 12,000 nodes because you can deduce the fact that from the valency of 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a simulation, right? So this is a simulation. We've randomly generated a graph and sort of spread it randomly all around the world, and then we've used the measurements of how fast does it take to shift data from one place to another based on the measurements that we saw earlier.
And then look at how long does it take a block to get to what fraction of the stake out there, right? Each node has a certain amount of stake. So if it gets to a main pool, it gets a slightly this number goes up more than if it gets to an individual lone rider.
So then that finally explains what actually the axes on this graph are. So on the x-axis we've got seconds, time. How long does it take to get somewhere? On the y-axis we're saying how long does it take to reach a certain percentage of the stake. So if you reach half of the stake pools in 5 seconds, let's say, then you've got, you've reached, what is it, 40% of the stake, because the stake pools are 80% of the stake. So it's how long?
No. Did
I get that wrong?
Actually, if you get in the sense that if you've reached half the stake in 5 seconds, you've reached 50% of the stake.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, I was talking about stake. That's simpler way to put it.
However, that's split, right? I mean, and if you think it's randomly, that 80% of that will be in the 80% of that 50% will be in the main pools, and 20% of that 50% would be in the other ones.
Okay. So the blue lines here are each individual simulated run.
Random graph. Yes.
Based on different random graphs. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is to sort of spread out. So yeah, we're assuming a randomly connected peer-to-peer graph, which perhaps we can do better than that, but it's a very good starting place because it says it's hard to do. Achieving a random graph is fairly straightforward.
Yes, and also some randomness is achievable. Is known to be achievable in this way.
And it has quite good security properties as well.
Yeah.
So it's a good reason to start from random is a good baseline, and then perhaps we can do better than that. But we want to make conservative assumptions when we're doing these calibrations. Okay. So then finally, this graph is showing us how long does it take to reach a certain fraction of all the other nodes
of the stake,
weighted by how much stake they have. So yes, that's why it's stake on the y-axis. So in the end, we see it has this dramatic shape of at the beginning
an S,
this S curve,
big S shape. Yeah.
And this is another view of the same data, right?
Yeah, so this is basically giving you, it's sort of looking into how much with 90% certainty, I will have reached 85% of the stake in 6 seconds, right? Is what this is trying to get there.
Yeah.
To give you a feel of how quickly you're getting there.
And then by the time you get to 7 seconds, you're up in the 95%. I mean, 90% of the time you're reaching 95% of the stake in 6 seconds or thereabouts. I can't quite read exactly where.
And that's sort of very good for performance and very good for the security is phenomenal at that point. Okay, the security, you're way outside the edge of the security constraints, so in that sense. But this is actually time is not the only measure that's of interest here, right? Because we have the subsequent stake pools have to build on the block that the previous one built. Will I reach the next leader in time? Which is a slightly different question for what percentage of the stake will I reach in time.
Yeah.
And so you have to have a slightly different approach, which is this way of modeling it. And then you end up with this sort of curve. Now, I'm going to let you explain this one, Duncan.
Yeah. This is basically like how the summary here is like how many blocks are we wasting? What fraction of blocks are we wasting? So everybody knows with Preos that you have slot battles or block height battles, whatever, and that's when you've got two slot leaders that get elected quite nearby, not possibly the same slot, but more generally like within a few slots of each other. We're assuming here 1 second slots, but if it takes several seconds to get from one slot leader to the next slot leader, if it so happens that Preos randomly elects 2 slot leaders that are a couple seconds apart, then the block just isn't going to make it in time.
If they happen to be physically distant apart,
right? Yeah, if they
happen to be in the
if they're both in Frankfurt, then it probably will work, and if they're not, then it wouldn't.
And that's so there's all these ifs that we've combined together in this one graph now.
So this graph is then plotting your active slot coefficients. That's the fraction of blocks that are inhabited, and we are probably going to go for 0.05. So that because that corresponds to, with 1 second slots, that corresponds to 1 block on average every 20 seconds. And that shows that with this particular simulation, this particular choice of parameters, this shows that we are achieving getting 1 block from 1 slot leader to the next approximately 80% of the time. You can see as it crosses that at the 0.05, which means that we're wasting 20% of those blocks.
Now, before everybody says, "Oh, that's a huge amount of waste," yeah. And because I hate to say this, but we are sort of time is running past us. How can you make that better? Well, what we can do, what we're going to actually launch with, is something that looks more like these numbers, right? Which now this is where we have 200 pools to start with, 1,000 individual running their own, still the same split, but now with a valency of 20 instead of 4.
Right. So the valency of 4 was quite unrealistic, and people running on the testnet, and we've benchmarked this. It's fairly easy to bump up the number of peers that each peer is connected to, and that reduces the path length. Basically, it reduces the number of hops. If each peer is connected to more other peers, then the number of hops it takes to get across the network to cover everybody is fewer hops. Shorter, just shorter time to distribute distribute the blocks.
And so going through the same sort of set of pretty pictures, you now end up with times like that.
It was more like 6 seconds, and here we're getting
4 seconds. It's perfect.
3 and 4.
Yeah. Right. 4 seconds. It's perfect. And then when you look at the waste, there is still obviously still some waste,
because that's inherent to the way Preos works. But
it's now less than
well above, or wastage is less than 10% now, or
right. So that's what we would expect. Now, just to finish off, because our time is running on, let's just say, well, how would this system scale with respect to larger block sizes? Okay. So I think I'm going to just go for these ones. So this is how long it takes to get there if the blocks are 1 meg.
So that's 1 meg. So now it's back up to 6 seconds.
Back up to 6 seconds.
Which
this is how long
we then expect.
How was the previous one? All right.
Yeah.
That was that one. That was this one. And how big if they were, but it doesn't take 2 meg doesn't take that much longer.
Yeah.
Right. And then I think, just to finish it up, I think the waste, the block height battles for this then is this.
So just flip back and forth between the
previous one, this one.
Yeah,
so
one.
That one
is sort of 10% and less, and then you multiply by a factor of 10 the block size, and our waste goes from sort of less than 10% to
15.
15, yeah.
And then when you go up a bit bigger, it hardly increases again.
Up to like 20% wastage.
Yeah.
So this is the nature of the Preos trade-off, that you drive it faster and you increase the fraction of times when blocks don't make it. You increase your waste, but you've significantly increased your throughput.
So we're already well into that territory, which basically no one would want to run.
Too fast to actually want to use a system like that.
Yeah.
So basically, the summary here is that there's clearly a range of parameters for Preos that will work. It passes both the Preos security requirements, and it will give us the TPS throughput that we're aiming for in the early release. And we've made various conservative assumptions. So we have things that we could perhaps make better, which then allows us to increase the block size if people want to increase the block size. Up to the sort of economic levels where it becomes, you wouldn't want to run it that quickly.
So if you take over the recording, I think we move on to the conclusion slides.
Let me share my screen again.
Because we've taken a bit too long, but we will be, as this is actually being recorded, we will be taking the questions and looking to answer them as quickly as we can after the end of the session.
Can you see my slide there? Conclusions?
It is there now, yes.
So summary, transaction bytes per second, we think, is a good measure. Cardano is as fast as you would want it. I think that's the big takeaway from the benchmarks.
And I think the point is, by configuration changes, you can go around part of these trade-offs. Your performance versus how decentralized you want it to be. Don't if you're willing to have centralized control, don't run Preos. You get a different set of scalability properties. But barrier to entry is important. This is supposed to be a system where you can you don't have to be a billionaire to enter, and geographic scale has a dramatic effect on this, as it would expect. Okay. And I think go on.
And then with Preos, the summary there is that it will work, and there's headroom for increasing the performance if we need to.
We haven't left much time for questions, I'm afraid, but we will be do take them, and we will be answering them as quickly as we can. And we can go on a little bit, I'm sure, unless they cut us off. We'll find out.
We will.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks very much.